Welcome to A State of Mind, the podcast that brings together consciousness, meditation, mindfulness, psychology, psychedelics, and so much more in pursuit of this mystery we call life. This is Julian Royce. Thank you so much for tuning in. Really excited about today's episode. I want to make a quick announcement. If you are enjoying and appreciating this podcast, please consider making a donation. You can do that at patreon.com/astateofmind. You can also support this show by sharing it with friends, posting about it on your social media accounts, and leaving us a good review. We have had some crazy weather here. I just want to share a few thoughts before we get to today's episode. The temperature dropped from, last week it was like 95 degrees one day, hot, sunny, smoky, smoggy, and the next day it went to like 35, and we had this snowstorm kind of come out of nowhere. And it makes me and a lot of us think of climate change. We've had terrible wildfires here in Colorado. The smoke and air quality has been really poor, not nearly as bad as on the West Coast, and it's just heartbreaking to see photos and videos from California and Oregon, and my heart really goes out to all the people, all the animals, all the plants and land that's being devastated right now by these wildfires. And it's interesting that in the Western United States wildfires are a natural part of the ecosystem. But as we know, with climate change, the weather is getting worse. They had terrible droughts on the West Coast that have made these fires worse. And these extreme weather patterns, like what we just experienced here last week, is a part of that. And I actually had someone come to see me for therapy and share with me the anxiety, the overwhelm, the sense of hopelessness that they feel around climate change, and how they've been working and protesting, and they've been an activist, and they've tried to do their part. And when the wildfires are here and this freak snowstorm happens, it really brings up for them a lot of helplessness. And so I think that to some degree that's an appropriate response. Climate change is heartbreaking, and it's something that's much bigger than any one of us. It's outside of our individual control. So I kind of take this attitude of, the best you can do is the best you can do, and then let go, because it is like I just said, it is outside of your control. And just to share with you guys, in my own life, I got slammed with like 3 difficult things all at once last week. And so sometimes life, we have the actual snowstorm come down, and then sometimes in our own life we have our own more private snowstorm, whether that's in your own emotions or in circumstances. Again, things to some degree outside of our control. Like it's tough when something challenging happens, and it's really tough when 3 or 4 challenging things happen, all on the same day. And it's at moments like that mindfulness I really feel the value of my practice of mindfulness, and I can slow down, be more in the moment, and let go of some of the racing thoughts, and then just respond as best I can moment by moment, and trust that things will work out even when I don't know how they're going to work out. One good thing to share with you all is I helped organize this outdoor event, and it went really well. It was really sweet. We had about, it was a small gathering, maybe 30 or so people outdoors in a beautiful campsite up in the Rocky Mountains. And I get reminded from time to time, as we all do, that coronavirus pandemic is still very much here, and we need to be careful. And I'm holding this tension that social connection is actually good for our immune system. Vitamin D is great for us. Being outside is great for us. Luckily, this event happened on a day when there wasn't a lot of smoke, and so we had great weather. People came together. We could practice social distancing, we could be outside, and we could still connect. And so I just wanted to offer that. I know a lot of people are feeling more and more isolated from coronavirus, and it's been 6 months now, and it's getting old, and it's hard to keep practicing social distancing. So I really do believe there are ways that we can come together in person that are responsible and that help remind us that we're not alone. So today's episode, I am talking with Aviva Bannerman. Aviva is a fellow therapist, and she is working with psychedelic assisted therapy. And I believe this is now the 4th episode here at A State of Mind on psychedelic assisted therapy. The very first episode of the podcast was with Dr. Carla Clements, and she shared her research with MAPS and MDMA assisted therapy happening right here in Boulder, Colorado. Then I had Pierre Bouchard on a few weeks ago. And so we continue this trend. It's a really exciting field and development in therapy that I think has the potential to help a lot of people. And Aviva works with cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy and ketamine. So she shares about that, and she talks about what healing can mean in the context of psychology. And I appreciated that part of our conversation. I appreciated hearing about her life a little bit and her calling to be a therapist and a healer, how she came to discover psychedelic-assisted therapy. And we talk again about the importance of set and setting and how having a positive, good intention is so important and how powerful that can be. We reflect a little bit on some of the legal challenges here and the positive developments in that arena, as well as on reflecting on the disaster that the so-called war of drugs has been for our society. So all in all, this was a great conversation. I think it will be useful and helpful to a lot of you listening. And I hope you get as much out of it as I did. Without further ado, I bring you Aviva Bannerman. Aviva, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, Julian.
Yeah, excited to do this. This is, I think, my 3rd podcast around psychedelics and therapy.
Awesome.
Which is great.
That's a great topic.
Such a fascinating subject.
Mm-hmm.
And you're working as a therapist now at a place called Innate Path, right?
Yep. So I work at a clinic called Innate Path, which is in Lakewood, Colorado, where we do ketamine and cannabis-assisted psychotherapy. And I also have a private practice in Boulder where I do somatic therapy and I also do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy.
Cool. And how did you get interested in this? Do you want to share, did you have a calling to be a therapist at some point? How did that come along?
So I feel like I was kind of born into psychology. That's like...
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ever since I was really young, I've been trying to improve. I've been oriented towards self-growth. I've been really excited about paying attention to relationships and the ways that people interact with each other. And so it was only natural. In undergrad, I decided to major in psychology. And I went to Middlebury College in Vermont, which was awesome. And I got a lot of the scientific background around psychology. And then after that, I decided to kind of go rogue, and I traveled for a few years. And I met people
Where did you travel to?
I traveled across the United States a couple times. I went down to Mexico, Guatemala. I lived in a tent in a tiny town on Lake Atitlan in Guatemala for 3 months. I went over to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Laos, and just had this incredibly epic and formative adventure where I was introduced to people who were really off the beaten path, where, I was introduced to hippies for the first time. And
really? You went to Middlebury?
That's true. But, there were hippies that were in the standard school still.
Yeah.
But, I was introduced to people who lived on the road, to festivals, to people who meditated. And that's where I got really excited about the body. I said I do somatic psychotherapy, and I had a couple of really awesome bodywork experiences where I realized that for the first time in my life, I realized that things are held in our bodies. And when I say things, I mean trauma is held and feelings are held in our body.
Right.
And that
like it's still alive somewhere in our system.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I've been talking about it.
Yes, absolutely.
What do you think about like positive things? Like they could be helping our body too, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's not always negative.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when you feel joy, it's like this body-based experience. Feelings are a body-based experience.
Right.
And so that's when I decided that I needed to do, if I was going to go back to school in psychotherapy, it needed to incorporate the body. And so I found Aropa.
That's good that you got that message, how important the body is. I feel like even in psychology, that's not something you can take for granted.
Yeah. It felt super clear and just super formative on my path. And so I went to Naropa, and that's also where I discovered psychedelic therapy.
Oh, cool.
MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, they have been spearheading the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant PTSD. So it's a long term.
It's a mouthful.
Yes.
And they're quite active here in Boulder. They've been doing some of the studies here in Boulder, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, the fact that I was in Boulder, and then they're active in Boulder, and there's actually like a really positive psychedelic therapeutic community in Boulder got me incredibly excited about the work.
So is there a moment where your thinking around psychedelics shifted? Like you encountered them in the context of therapy instead of at a festival or, with the hippies in Guatemala?
I'd say there's not really a moment, but I think this happens to a lot of people who go to festivals. You explore psychedelics and then realize the healing capacities of them. They're like, sure, they can
just
be
just experientially.
Exactly.
A lot of people have that insight realization, even if they weren't thinking about that ahead of time or realizing it.
Right. And so then for it to be really formalized in like a trial that's being done for MDMA made it an easier platform to talk about. I remember talking to my parents about it and saying, well, this is a study that has multi-millions of donors and they're really trying to make it legal. And it was a platform where I could actually talk about it, where it was, it wasn't just cast aside as like a traveling hippie that people tend to cast aside. Whereas
it's like dismissive attitude.
It's a very dismissive attitude.
It's a shame because there's so much potential there.
There's so much potential, and it's kind of a travesty that people are cast aside based on where they're at in the world. And if they're in a mainstream
social location, And there's also the history is so fascinating to me. So Naropa is kind of known for the transpersonal psychology program. Transpersonal psychology that a lot of people haven't heard of, has its roots in psychedelics and people like Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, and that we could have experiences that go beyond our personal self, transcendent experiences that maybe union with nature or a sense of oneness with all, however you want to think about it. There's like a huge realm of different experiences, vast. It's not just like there's one kind of mystical experience. It's like there's millions of kinds of mystical experiences.
Absolutely.
And so this was like a psychology that wanted to study that and look at that and honor that. And, but it was also I think Timothy Leary gets a lot of blame for psychedelics becoming illegal for good reason. He was over the top. He was promoting them too much, maybe exaggerating the benefits because I think it's a risky thing. There's potential benefits, but there's also risks, right?
Oh, yeah. And we've seen that a little bit at Innate Path and in my private practice, where people come in and they think, okay, we'll just do 1 or 2 sessions and then I'll be good, I'll be healed. It's like this magic button. And I'm like, no, that's not
a magic bullet.
It works.
Right.
Yeah, it requires a lot of diligent and hard work to really get to your traumas and process them.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking it's also kind of an interesting story of culture and counterculture. And maybe now our culture is coming to a place of synthesis where we can actually study these scientifically, we can actually use them in certain ways, we can develop protocols to make them safe and effective. Rather, because there's that countercultural element, which I'm also, a fan of and have been influenced by, but it's kind of rejecting society. And I see psychedelic therapy as a movement that is within society. It's using therapy and psychology. It's helping people heal in their lives here in this world.
I think that's what's so exciting about it, and exciting about where we are right now, because this hasn't really happened before, where there is that merging.
Yeah.
And, MDMA is hopefully going to become legal in a therapeutic setting within the next couple of years. And that does represent the merging of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you're working with psychedelic-assisted therapy now, it's with cannabis and ketamine, right?
Because those are the 2 legal ones here in Colorado.
So that's the main reason why you think that.
They're both really great.
They're both great,
so, I don't want to undermine them at all.
Yeah.
And once other medicines become legal, I would love to work with them as well, incorporate them into what I do, too.
Yeah, interesting. So, I just had the podcast with Pierre Bouchard, and we talked about ketamine, and I was kind of thinking about it. It's almost like it's been surprising to me to hear about ketamine clinics and its application in therapy. I think it's great. I just never thought about that until fairly recently. And it's, I think, like what you said, because it was already legal and a prescription drug, it kind of had this application that people have realized.
I remember being shocked when I found out that people were using ketamine for a psychedelic therapy, because it's known as a dissociative.
Right,
so...
right. And normally therapy, you want to go towards your pain, not disassociate. That disassociation could perpetuate trauma, could create PTSD. I mean, that's often the response to trauma, is to disassociate.
Right.
Right.
And the reason it's actually so good is because it creates enough space between you and your pain so that you actually can feel the pain. It almost like softens it a little bit, and it doesn't mean it's easy. It's still really hard. I mean, after conducting enough therapy sessions, I know it's hard, and also doing my own therapy.
That's a good point. If someone's going into ketamine-assisted therapy, it's not like a blissful ride on a roller coaster or something. It's like you're going into that pain, right? You're working with difficult.
Exactly, and the dissociation just gives you a little bit of like a buffer zone so that you can feel that pain.
Yeah, so that's fascinating to me. So I guess I could connect that to the idea of a witness, that we have this witnessing consciousness or witnessing awareness, and maybe ketamine helps you to identify more with the witness, and then you can experience it, but there's a little bit of that separation. It's not, because it's like we can experience something and be totally identified with that experience, and that's actually maybe not very helpful. Maybe that's what's creating some of the trauma. So if we can feel that experience and then know that's not all of who I am, but still access the experience, you're not blocking it off. I think that's that sweet spot, right?
I love the way you just described that. I think that the witness function is really important, so that you're not, just completely in it. And actually part of what we do and the type of psychotherapy that I use is process dissociation. And the way you process dissociation is by staying with it. But dissociation, I mean, it's like, it oftentimes manifests as people just floating away off into the ethers, or, it's hard to stay with it. And so part of my job is to stay in contact with my clients when they're dissociating, so that they can tell me what's happening, and they can have that witness function online, and then they can process the dissociation through their bodies.
Oh, interesting. So they're actually processing the disassociation itself.
Yep.
And staying with that. That seems so tricky.
Yeah, it can be. It can be really tricky.
Do you want to share with us a little bit of how you would work with someone if you're noticing, okay, they're disassociating right now in this moment? What would you say to them or do?
So it's easy for them to float off. So it's really important for them to stay in contact with me. So I might say something like, hey, let's really stay close here. I want to really be in relationship with you.
Nice.
And then encourage them to tell me what it feels like to be floating off, or to tell me what it feels like to have no access to your body, or no access to your emotions, or oftentimes parts of people dissociate. So, maybe their left side dissociated and their right side didn't, and therefore you can't feel your whole left side. What's it like to not have a left side? What's going on in your right side? Where is the disconnection of where you can feel and where you can't feel? Really asking questions so that they're staying with the process, they have that witness function online, and they're not gonna get floating off.
Right. No, I love that. So they're like, what does that feel like to not feel your body? It's like
it's a tricky one.
Tricky question, but
sometimes they're like, what? How do I answer that? I'm like, I don't know, just do something.
But I think there's always some kind of feeling component, or there's some kind of experience happening, and if you can be aware of it and put it into words, like that is building these bridges.
Well, exactly. And then oftentimes what happens is, as they're noticing the dissociation, it's processing through, and it turns into what we call hot symptoms, which is like the fear or the terror that you were feeling before you dissociated. Because that's the reason we dissociate during traumatic events. It's because they're too overwhelming, and we can't get out, and there's nothing for us to do but leave. And the way we leave is just, by dissociating. But there's a reason, there's a point, a moment of overwhelm. And so as you start to process the dissociation, then you get underneath to that terror and that overwhelm that you felt.
Right.
And so that's how you know that you're processing it. It's like all of a sudden that left side comes alive and it like moves in a way where maybe you were trying to protect yourself, or maybe there was a lot of energy and you're shaking. But that indicates that there's movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's fear is often a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you, if someone came to you and was interested in ketamine therapy, like what kind of things would you recommend it for? And are there certain things you'd not recommend it for?
Mm-hmm. So, the typical people who come are people who have PTSD, anxiety, depression, usually treatment resistant. They've tried a lot of other things. We get a lot of calls from people who are like, I've been trying everything for the last 10 years. And now I see psychedelic therapy is here, and can we try this too? It's kind of like their last hope. At the same time, we also get people who don't identify as having a lot of trauma in their background. I do my own work doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy with my own therapist, and I don't identify as having PTSD, and I'm fairly happy in life, and it's still incredibly helpful for me.
Cool. That's cool to hear. So for you, maybe more personal growth, more of your own journey, your exploration.
Yeah, and what I would say is that stuff comes up. Maybe I don't have like quote unquote big T traumas, but I go back to these places that I didn't even really realize were affecting me so intensely.
Yeah, it becomes subtle, right? I think trauma is like a lot of these things we're talking about, it's a spectrum. Like depression, everyone has their ups and downs. But then like clinical depression, is this big thing that, hopefully most of us don't have. But
I get so many people who are like, I don't know if I should be here. I don't know if I'm like taking the space of somebody else who really needs it. And it's like, you should be here. If you have the inclination to heal and to grow and you want to use this modality, let's do it.
Yeah.
There's stuff here that we can work.
I love that. Like, I really want to normalize seeing a therapist. Like, I think a lot of the stigma is less, but it's still there. And I think that we, more and more people, we could use it for improving our quality of life rather than for getting rid of some severe mental health disorder, right?
Yep. I'll say on the record, I've been in therapy for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
And it's been amazing for me. Just amazing in terms of personal self-growth, in terms of learning new skills and how to communicate with people and how to better my my relationships. It's an investment, but it is so worth it. Yeah.
And it's expensive. Like you said, it's an investment, but it's like, if you look at all the money we spend on a gym membership or healthy food, or if you're interested in deepening your relationships, that's where I see therapy as one of the ways it can really help people. And another way is if you are on a spiritual path or a meditator or really into yoga, seeing a therapist or a coach or whoever who can like have a one-on-one relationship with you and like delve into some of those things, that can be super helpful.
I mean, I honestly, like, my ideal world would be assign a therapist at birth. It's like, you need a mentor. And we don't have enough mentors in this society.
Like a one-on-one human interaction.
Yes, who's not your parent.
He's not your parent.
I think that would make this world a much better place.
Well, I think a lot of other cultures and pre-modern cultures had so much more community involvement in raising children. And then, throughout your whole life. And
now you just have, maybe you have two parents, maybe not.
Right. And maybe they're both working.
They're supporting the family monetarily. So they're doing all the work of, what maybe a tribe would have separated into separate jobs beforehand and then helped with the kids. And now you have to hire childcare and, really make space to spend time with your kid. And you might be burnt out or tired. So, therapist at birth. Let's do it.
That'd be cool to see on the presidential ballot.
Yeah. I'll run on that.
Could use some of our stimulus money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, if you can see a therapist sooner rather than later, like, so the trauma doesn't build up in your system, so the anxiety doesn't build up, the depression, all this stuff, it can kind of accumulate, and often people only seek help at a point of crisis when they're when they have to.
Exactly. And it makes me think, I don't know how true this is, but somebody once told me that couples on average seek out couples counseling 6 years after they should have. When they're they're like at the very end. And if they had just, sought it out a few years earlier, they would have been in a much better place to do the work that they need to do.
Right. Yeah. Well, hopefully, even if that is the case, like you can learn from going to couples therapists, and maybe that relationship ends, and the next one you have some more tools and some more understanding.
Right.
That's part of how I see it. But
Yeah.
I've definitely seen that where, especially like couples, there's so much in the relationship. You build up a little ecosystem between yourselves, and you get so used to things being a certain way. And if 6 years, 10 years go by, 15 years, it can be very hard to change those kinds of patterns.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, a system, you get those patterns and then they get pretty rigid.
Right.
And actually, it's really interesting because sometimes one person in the couple will go to therapy and they'll start to change, which means that the whole system has to change. Mm-hmm. And that's really scary. And I tell my clients, like, yeah, you're going to get pushback. You're going to get backlash if you start putting up boundaries that you never put up before. And are you ready for that?
Like, prepare for that.
Yep.
And have you done couples work with psychedelic therapy? Is that part of it?
No, haven't done any couples work, although that would be awesome.
You think that could be good with ketamine, for example?
I think it would be great for MDMA.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think ketamine, I don't know. That would be an interesting experiment. It depends. Ketamine affects people differently. And sometimes it does send people into very dissociative states where it's much harder to relate to a partner. Whereas I think MDMA, people call it the love drug, and it's about connection. So that's the one that I would choose.
That was being used like in the early 80s, right?
It was being used,
so there was a period before it was illegal, is that right?
Yeah.
It's interesting history.
Yep.
It seems like a huge potential there for healing and
huge potential. I'm very hopeful that MDMA will become legal.
Interesting. So maybe in a couple years. Mm-hmm. And then when you say legal, it's like it would be a prescription, right?
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't be able to buy in an APC store.
Exactly. So similar thing to ketamine, where you would go to somebody who could prescribe it to you, and then you would use it in a psychotherapeutic setting. Mm-hmm.
And then what about cannabis? Mm-hmm. So people are doing that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
And there's another, I see a huge potential there too, but that one gets used a lot more habitually by a lot of people. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people use cannabis to help alleviate their symptoms, but then the same people will come into my office, and I mean like cannabis all day long because of intense PTSD symptoms. They'll come into my office, they'll smoke cannabis in a different setting, and all of a sudden it will bring up all of their symptoms.
So they'll smoke in the office with you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is it like an hour-long session?
2 hours.
2 hours, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so they get to decide on their dosage. I have nothing to do with the medication. They get it themselves, they bring it in, and then they use it in session. And because, set and setting is really like a really big piece to this, where it's the mindset.
Do you want to share what that is a little bit?
Sure, yeah. It's mindset of healing, and then the setting of my office with a therapist. Mm-hmm. Then that you're actually, it's not about suppressing your symptoms, it's about bringing them up so you can work them.
Yeah, so the intention is a big piece of that.
Huge piece of that, yeah. I think similar thing with MDMA. Like a lot of people use MDMA in festival settings, at shows, with friends, and oftentimes their intention is to connect with people, whereas in the studies the set and setting is totally different, and people actually really go into their traumas and have very difficult experiences, which is very different than when people do it recreationally.
Right. Yeah, I think they could both potentially be valuable, but that intention to actually work through your pain, I think, is so important that you're speaking to.
Yeah.
It's interesting with cannabis that it's. I think that just shows how powerful the set and setting is. Mm-hmm. And how there's this potential there, and how it could be missed or not, activated. And
I've heard people say things like, "I had no idea this could do this to me," and like, "I will never smoke in the same way again."
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So maybe it could help people who are habitually using it use less, or to be more mindful. Change their relationship with it. Yeah,
or, then they could go home and then smoke it in the way that they need to in terms of helping to moderate their symptoms.
Yeah.
And then know that it'll be a different experience when they come back, and it's time to bring up those symptoms again to work them.
Beautiful. Yeah, I actually have a client recently who, I hope I'm saying this right, he has this condition called CHS. Have you heard of this?
I haven't.
Oh man, I'm not sure what exactly that stands for, but
is it a cannabis disorder?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's someone who has used quite heavily for years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he relied on it, and it was his lifestyle and it was his support. And I think talking about trauma, like it was how he was managing. And now anytime he has even a little bit, or he can't even have CBD. If he has a little bit, he will have extreme nausea and actually have to go to the hospital.
I have heard about that.
So it's really extreme. People have actually died from this. I didn't know that. I just learned this recently.
I had a client actually who had this, and he was coming to me. He just wanted to do the somatic work without any assistance of medicine, which is totally possible too. Yeah. And he was coming because he was trying to get off cannabis because he had this condition.
Oh, wow. That's tough. Mm-hmm. I think maybe it builds up in our system. Maybe this kind of condition will become more common as more people use it. Mm-hmm. Maybe I wonder if it's afflicting people who started at a younger age and like have used it over years and it's kind of built up.
Yeah, I really don't know much about it, but it's really interesting to me.
It's gnarly.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I love this idea of using cannabis-assisted therapy, and I guess like so they can just use as much or as little as they want.
With cannabis?
Basically.
Yeah. I don't make recommendations about what they want to use. It's really up to the person.
What kind of things do you notice when you are doing that kind of work with someone? Like what kind of states are they entering or
with cannabis?
Yeah.
Honestly, it looks really similar from the outside as a ketamine session.
Really?
Yeah, I would say with ketamine there's probably more of a dissociative element and it's easier to get into dissociation. But they process in the same way. So I've actually had some clients who've tried both and been very sure that, either cannabis was their medication or ketamine was. And I remember thinking, I don't see a difference from the outside. Oh, wow. But they see a huge difference from the inside.
Okay, so they would prefer one or the other?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, people definitely get preferences.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder with some of these substances, like the definition of psychedelics that I like, because it's hard to define. Like, what does that word mean? What are we talking about here? It's like the definition I like is like a non-specified experiential amplifier. So it's like not like we don't know what will happen, especially with a true psychedelic like LSD or something.
Yeah.
But something's going to happen. You don't know what it is, and it's going to be amplified. It's going to be intense. It's going to be intensified.
Yes.
And I think cannabis can have I don't know. I'm not as familiar with ketamine, but I think cannabis can have that quality too. And so it's like. It just makes so much sense that you could. That's why the set and setting is so important. Because you're kind of setting the stage for what will come. But there's like this, and you're like, I don't know, you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
and the effects. Part of what I'm trying to say, the effects are so varied.
Yeah.
That it's hard to like have a more specific definition. Like you can't say, this is going to happen. Like.
Right.
Or it'll affect you this way.
Well, that's why my job is so exciting. It's like, I walk into every session being like, I don't know what we're going to get. And it looks really different for different people. People tend to have very, similar movements. We call them waves throughout their body as they're processing things. So I notice a trend, but it can be really different. Like maybe one day you'll process a bunch of like terror, and then the next day you'll be processing dissociation, which is like much slower paced session because you're dissociating.
So you're really just obviously working with what's coming up there in that moment for them.
Yeah, I'm along for the ride. And and really this therapy is about listening to my clients' nervous systems and helping them listen to the nervous system because their body is the expert at healing them. That's not me. I'm going to kind of help nudge them along the right direction, but their body is what's doing it.
I like that. That was actually on my list of questions for you is like, what is healing? Like when we're talking about healing, I mean, if you break an arm, the bone is broken, you can see an x-ray, you can get the cast, you can come back in a year, you can get an x-ray, oh, it's healed. But when we're talking about therapy, psychology, PTSD, depression, it's like a lot more amorphous.
It's true. Yeah. It definitely makes it a challenge to talk about my job sometimes. But what I would say, based on my experience up until now, and this answer could be different in a year, but, I see this state of, disease or dis-ease as kind of like things not being let go and processed through. So when people come and they're holding back their feelings, well, if they could just let those tears out or let that crying through, it's going to come out and process, and you're not going to have to spend so much time and resources pushing it away, which we all do.
Like
even
that takes energy to like
takes so
push
much
something
energy.
down, push it away.
Yeah. We do it subconsciously, usually.
Right.
But I think that healing is like actually feeling safe enough to let it through.
Right.
And to be vulnerable and to have that intimacy.
Let yourself
with somebody.
feel that, let it come through. Yeah, and to do it in connection with someone.
Right.
It's almost like we're like rivers, you know, and like if the water gets muddy or dammed up somewhere, eventually it's gotta flow through.
Well, like think about it physically, right? Like we eat and then we let it out. Like same thing emotionally. It's gotta come in and then come out. Right.
And I think I've seen some people who are therapists, who are very mature people, like able to like, okay, they're having a difficult experience, and then they can choose to put it off and then process it and then let it go, or, let it move through them.
Yeah.
But there can be a skill of knowing when and where to do that work. So it doesn't mean that like it's just automatically happening all the time.
Well, right. It's the same as being like diaper trained, right?
That's a good analogy.
The boundaries. and as a therapist, things come up for me, if somebody's going through some really intense experience that's triggering some of my experiences, in session, I might feel emotion come up, and then I have to make the decision, is this going to be useful for me here, or is this something that I really just need to put aside, keep my attention on my client, and then talk about in supervision?
Okay, yeah. You're able to like put that to the side for yourself for a minute.
Yeah, literally, sometimes I like say that. Say, okay, I've got this part that's feeling this way. I'm just going to put you aside, but I'm going to come back to you later. And then like the part...
So it's like some inner dialogue.
Yeah, inner dialogue.
Nice.
Yep.
Well, that's great. And so have you seen, I guess another question I had for you is like, have you seen people reducing their, for example, cannabis use through coming to see you?
Yes. I will say most of my clients choose the ketamine route.
Oh, okay.
So I have more experience with people who use ketamine, but I have certainly seen people reduce their cannabis use. Oftentimes it kind of comes in waves, like maybe they'll have a week of very little use, and then we'll touch into something that's really intense, and then the use will go up throughout the rest of the week. But it's certainly, it's people who have been using for sometimes like years or decades, and this is the first time they've been able to reduce.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting with cannabis how differently it seems like it can affect different people.
Oh, yeah.
And how, like you're describing someone who sounds like they have some PTSD, they have some trauma, and they're using that to help them manage. I mean, there's a lot of other people who are artists or musician or, I don't know. I know people in the tech world who, in my experience of them, they seem like they're using a lot of cannabis, but they're very high functioning in their job. So it can kind of be used in different ways for different people.
Yeah.
But I think it is something that is addictive, even though a lot of people who are pro-cannabis don't want to say that. But I think that's being honest, and I think it's psychologically addictive. And I think a lot of people, when I talk to them and they're really honest, they actually do want to reduce their use if they're a consistent user. And so I think something like what you're offering could be such a great way to have a new relationship with it, reevaluate it, experience it in a new way, and then maybe shift some of those patterns. Yeah. So, agreed.
Yeah. And, that's not always the intention. Really the intention is whatever my client comes in with. I don't have an agenda for them to smoke any less outside of therapy.
You're just like non-judgmental about it, let them make their own choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then sometimes they come to that themselves, or, they'll come in and they'll say, I can't believe how little I smoked this week. And, we'll talk about whether or not that feels like a success. And it usually does, because people don't want to be totally dependent.
You don't want to be dependent on something. Yeah.
Exactly.
There's something in us that doesn't feel good.
Right.
Yeah. It's that quality of freedom, independence, of not needing something, but then you can make a free choice.
Right. Well, it's hard too when, my clients go home for vacation and they live in a state where it's not legal. And then it really shows up of like, oh my gosh, I have been smoking 24/7 for the last 5 years, and now I have to worry about my freedom if I'm going to go visit my family.
Yeah. So it feels kind of limiting that way. Probably too. Great. So you're looking forward to MDMA becoming legal, hopefully?
I'm really looking forward to that.
Are there any other... What about psilocybin? Is that...
Oh, that'd be great.
Is that in the works as well?
Psilocybin is currently decriminalized. which is great.
Just in Denver, right?
In Denver, oh yeah, and decriminalize in Denver. I think that there's an initiative working on it in Boulder too.
Cool.
But so we get a lot of people who are like, okay, great, let's do psilocybin therapy, and like, well, it's still illegal, so I can't ethically do that right now.
That's a funny one to be illegal because it's a mushroom. The spores are probably in the air right now, like they float around the whole world. So it's like, I wonder, like, it'd be interesting to talk to like a lawyer who really knows a lot. Like, how are we making these plants like illegal? Is it illegal for a mushroom to grow? Are you going to put the mushroom in a prison cell?
Right.
Because it's existing.
Or like, with cannabis, there are some laws around how it's okay if it's on the plant, but then once you harvest it, if you have this much, then like, it's yeah.
It's a little silly.
Yeah.
I think we're all, or at least everyone who's been on this podcast so far would agree, like the war on drugs has been such a disaster.
Yeah.
And so part of this conversation, like you can't ignore that. I mean, this is hopefully helping provide a different route for our culture to take. That's not mass incarceration, that's not racist, that's not nonviolent drug users.
The war on drugs is racist. It's totally
that,
racist.
And I agree completely. But I think it's exciting to see that becoming culturally accepted. Like that's no longer a fringe statement. Maybe 10 years ago it would have been. But the reality wasn't different 10 years ago. It's just our understanding collectively is shifting.
Right. Well, I think everything that we're talking about right now would be a fringe statement 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Or even 5 years ago.
It really does feel like cutting edge. Like, this is our society changing. And the war on drugs, what a disaster.
Yeah.
And it's, I think the negative effects from that are just, they're so massive. I think we're going to be feeling them for a long time. It's going to talk about healing.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot of healing.
Yeah.
And I honestly see a lot of abuse or misuse of substances as coming out of that paradigm. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Like if they were legal, if their medicinal benefits were recognized and honored in the appropriate ways, then there would be a lot less misuse.
Absolutely. I think that there would also be a lot of ways where people were doing it in a much safer environment.
Right. And you can know what it is you're taking.
Exactly. Right now, people don't know what they're taking. You get it on the streets, and it's like, well, all right, let's take it and see what happens.
Yeah.
And
even with cannabis, if you're in a state where it's illegal, there's a good chance that what you're getting is sprayed with chemicals or who knows, and so it's not good.
Yeah, or like ketamine has been known to be cut with fentanyl.
Oh, God.
I mean, that's deadly.
Yeah.
Literally.
It could literally kill you.
Yeah. And it has. It does kill people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, the war on drugs is a travesty here. And, I'm incredibly grateful to the people who are on the front lines fighting that.
Like organizations like MAPS, that seems like the most well-respected one. Yeah,
and then other people, like decriminalize Denver and decriminalize Boulder. They're, I want to make sure I'm getting my facts right, but they've led the initiative for decriminalizing mushrooms, and other people who are doing the work legislatively, and
it takes time, but slowly.
Yeah,
but I think
happening.
Part of what I was going to say, the psilocybin mushrooms being decriminalized, it doesn't mean they can be prescribed. Obviously, it doesn't mean it's not the same as being legal.
Right, it's not legal yet, but it's the next step.
I actually heard a story about some guy, I forget his name, in Denver who was growing a bunch of psychedelic mushrooms, and like Vice News came and did a news segment on him, and he didn't conceal his identity well enough, and he was showing them how he was growing them, and then he got arrested and he's in jail right now.
Oh my God.
So decriminalized doesn't mean legal.
Definitely not. Especially if you have a big grow.
Especially if you have a large amount, right? And your intention is to sell, that's still very much illegal.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Seems like a public service announcement to say that. Because I have people call me and ask me about that, and it's still illegal. It's still you can't get it from a doctor.
Right.
And maybe that'll shift. I hope it does, but it seems like a few years at least.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into why it takes so long? It's they have to do scientific studies, and the FDA has to approve, and.
Well, with MAPS, they've had to do 3 different full trials. So right now they're in their 3rd one, and they're in stage 3. And then after stage 3, right now they're getting approved something called compassionate care or expanded access, which is a fast track for the FDA to legalize it to a very small amount of people to be able to use it therapeutically. And it just takes a long time. Every time they submit a proposal, I think then the FDA has like a month or so to respond. So, then they respond, and then they have a month or so. It just takes a long time. It's really bureaucratic. And they also really want to make sure that it's safe because it's so on the fringe.
Well, in that part I agree with. I mean, that makes sense. Like any new drug should be tested so that it's safe.
I agree with that too. And if you look at like the SSRIs that people are taking, there are massive amounts of side effects that are horrendous.
Right.
I mean, one side effect is increased rate of suicide.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like
for an antidepressant.
Exactly. That is totally legal and prescribed to many Americans.
Right.
And so
how is that safe?
It feels like there are different standards here.
It does. Yeah, and it's also like these psychedelics we're talking about aren't new.
Right.
Like, there was good research actually done in the 60s before they became illegal, so why can't we use that research? Why do we have to redo everything? I don't know, but here we are.
Yeah.
I actually heard, James Fadiman, he's a kind of famous scientist, talking about that. He's like, we did good research back in the 60s, you guys should use that. And they're like repeating all the studies they already did. Because, and there may be some truth that some of the old studies weren't done in quite the right protocol or quite the right rigor or whatever, but it's also kind of a shame and kind of ridiculous to like we are on the cutting edge, but it's like this cutting edge should have happened in the 60s or the 50s, right?
I mean, the rate of suicide for people with PTSD is huge, and so it's like we need this treatment. We need this treatment to be fast tracked. Yeah, because they're finding that people with treatment resistant PTSD are actually healing from this. And for this to almost be available and for somebody to literally not be able to live his or her life because there are too many triggers in terms of going out of the house, driving, hearing loud noises, I mean, that's not okay. Right. They need to be able to get this treatment because we know that it works. Yeah.
Yeah, when you say PTSD, I immediately think of veterans. They're such a big population that we should be doing everything we can to help.
Right.
And absolutely. The other thing that has been exciting to learn about is end-of-life care with psilocybin and how that's helped people face death, like come to a sense of peace with who they are and how they've lived their life. And that seems so invaluable to me,
Yeah, it actually like gives them a renewed sense of purpose for the last few months or the last few years. And I
think that should be fast-tracked. I mean, I think if you only have a year or so left to live, it really doesn't make sense to have something like that be illegal.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
We're on our way.
See if we can get through the rest of 2020.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Unfortunately, the MAPS protocol has been suspended for a short period of time because you really have to be in person for it, and so they're suspending it at least until the end of the year, and then we'll see.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's being fast-tracked is, all the coronavirus vaccines or medications. And, this is another topic, but I've seen so many, we've seen so many conspiracy theories about all this stuff and people who are against the vaccines and people who are freaked out about Bill Gates. And I guess in the podcast world, this kind of thing gets talked about a lot, but it really is scary, like the conspiracy theory stuff. I think there are legitimate conspiracies. It actually relates 100% to psychedelics because like the phrase conspiracy thinking was like kind of propagated by the CIA to discredit. But there in the 60s, but there was an actual CIA conspiracy to like give people LSD without them knowing about it, MK Ultra. It's super disturbing to learn about that stuff. Yep. And so this history of America and conspiracy theories and psychedelics are intertwined because of our own government, because of the CIA. Yeah. And so it's fascinating.
Well, I think that's actually like what was so important about the years that I spent traveling because I was the kid, I think in like 6th grade, I cut a little poster out of the teen magazine that said 99 ways to say no to weed and still be cool. Oh, yeah. I highlighted my top 5.
Like a dare or whatever.
Something like that, yeah. And so that's the environment that I grew up in.
Me too. So when I was in 5th grade, I won an essay writing contest for DARE.
Wow. Was,
I forget what DARE even stands for. But the Just Say No, anti-drug stuff.
Yeah, right.
And then I had to read it in front of the whole school, which was a terrifying experience. And then the thing that what I was reading, I like remember reading this and being like, wow, this is so dorky, like, you know? And I'm just like basically repeating this stuff. And then later when I'm older and learn more, a lot of it wasn't really true, you know?
Exactly. It's like you need to unlearn.
You need to, yeah. So we were like taught things that weren't true by our government.
Right.
That's not helpful. I think truth is what we need.
And I think that we're getting that less and less because, you know, I look at all the news articles and I'm like, I don't know what to believe.
It's crazy.
It's so confusing to me.
It is. It's confusing. But then there's some stuff out there like the QAnon conspiracy stuff that's so far out there. I think it's really hurting. I mean, the waters are getting very muddy.
Yeah.
What to believe, what's true.
Yep.
So yeah, we live in confusing times. Mm-hmm. We feel like we can't trust our government. We can't trust the media. Why people then feel like they can trust some random person on YouTube, I don't understand that. Some guy living in a shack, you know, or their parents' basement, they figured it all out. Like, why, you know? I get why you might not trust like the mainstream account, but all of a sudden you're like a true believer in some other theory. It's like I think we're being challenged to live with uncertainty. And that's really hard for us.
Yeah, that's really hard. It's actually interesting because that relates to sessions where it's like my clients and I are totally uncertain when we're going into those sessions. We don't know what's going to happen. We're just listening to the nervous system. And so it is a practice in living with uncertainty. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And that's a big part of meditation. Uncertainty, being with not knowing. And it can be scary. It can be liberating.
Yep.
And it can be more honest. But then there's like some steps, like when we talk about our collective world, like, you know, there are things that we should be able to agree on, certain facts, I believe, and that needs to be
nice.
that needs to be spoken to more.
Yeah.
Maybe one day we'll have better leadership.
Hopefully.
But I see people taking some of these meditation teachings, like in Zen, there's a big thing about not knowing, be in the mind of not knowing. I don't think that translates 100% to politics. Like, we need to be able to know some things and talk about some things.
Or like trust.
Yeah,
trust our
great
leadership.
trust. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, do you have any last words or thoughts on this? It's exciting to see you and you're inspired with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I'm super inspired with the work that I'm doing.
Great.
I just feel so grateful and lucky that I'm able to do this type of work, that I'm able to use the substances that we use right now that are legal, and that, you know, I fully believe in my lifetime I'll be able to use other substances too. It's really exciting and really exciting to talk about my work. So thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you got something of value from this podcast and want to show your appreciation, please consider making a donation. You can do that at patreon.com/astateofmind. Even $2, $5, or $10 makes a big difference. I am unrolling some benefits for subscribers, so check that out. To learn more about this podcast, show notes, and to see all the episodes, and to see a bunch of cool photos taken during its creation, check out astateofmindplay.com. And to learn more about my work as a therapist, meditation teacher, and coach, go to julianocean.us. And in a few weeks, I'm hoping to move to the website astateofmindcounseling.org. So hopefully by October 2020, that'll be up. So thank you so much. Feel free to send me a message, be a part of the conversation here. I love hearing from you guys. I love hearing feedback. And I'm wishing you all a wonderful day or night, wherever you're at in this world. And I will see you here next time.